Hi, welcome to Chad's Silversmithing. I thought today would be a nice time to address an issue that I hear from a lot of people. As far as people, as they get older, start having some knuckle issues with rings. And so I came up with a design to deal with that. It involves kind of a box clasp kind of band that pops onto the head of the ring. I think it'll be kind of fun to try to put together, so we'll give it a shot, and maybe we'll come up with something pretty and useful. So before we get started on that, I wanted to thank some people. I have some new patrons over on my Patreon, and I'd like to thank Valerie H., Nicole, and John A. Thank you for signing up. I appreciate your support. I know that you'll find a whole bunch of really nice people over there that you can swap ideas with and share information with. It's a nice community, so thanks for joining that, and thank you to my previous patrons as well. The other group are my YouTube subscribers. We just passed 26,300 people, which is awesome. Thank you for that. You can't possibly know how much I appreciate the nice comments from people. It really helps when I'm tired and I don't feel like doing this. Some of the positive input I get is really, really kind and really thoughtful. I also really appreciate when you share your knowledge as well, and I think some of my watchers also benefit from that, so thank you for that. I appreciate it. I also appreciate the financial support, the buy me a coffees, the super thanks, the people who buy my merch or my ebooks. Those things all keep my channel sustainable and allow me to continue to do this, so thank you for that. I really couldn't do it without your help. So, all right, well, let's get started on this little kind of large knuckle ring or a box clasp band or whatever we're going to call it. I'm not sure. So this is one of my design idea sketchbooks that are available on my merch store. This particular one has some information about different solder types and their melting and flow temperatures. I find that useful. Some others that I have on the site have different covers and different information on the back, like there's some conversion charts and some information about copper and silver and things like that. So what I really like about them, though, is the stop matrix in the background, because it allows me to sketch things better since I'm not super good at drawing pictures. Well, I'm getting better, but it helps to have this graph matrix in the background. I also love the fact that I now have a perpetual record of things I've made, and that's kind of nice, so I can look back and see how I did it again if I want to revisit that. This is kind of what I had in mind today. One of the most, like I said, one of the most common things I run into is people at shows telling me that they have trouble with their rings anymore because their knuckles have grown and they can't get things past their knuckles. And so that's such a common problem for people. I thought it would be nice to do something that would should at least solve that for them if they go with something like this. The idea being that we'll have a band that detaches from the head, and you put the band on and then snap the head right on top of it. So, and then to remove it, push these little buttons on the side and have the band come out. At least that's my plan, so I think that's what we're going to do. I was just thinking while I was getting ready, I initially was going to do 14 gauge square wire around this, but I'm already going to put some thick sheet underneath the bezel where the stone's going to be, and this is the stone that I picked. It's I didn't even measure it. Let's see what it is. Oh, 18 by 9? 18 by 9-ish. And I believe it's from Persia or Iran. And it's going to go like that. And so we'll have a bezel set on top of this piece of sheet here. And bezel I'm going to use is 3/16 inch fine silver bezel strip in 26 gauge, which in metric is 4.76 millimeters by 0.41 millimeters. I will definitely be filing that shorter because that's the kind of tall stuff I buy that I use for everything, and then file it down to what I need. 18 gauge sheet is 1 millimeter. And I think what I'm going to use for both this part and the part that's underneath here that creates the little box that these little clasps are going to pop into is going to be flattened 10 gauge square wire, which starts out at 2.6 millimeters if I remember right, and I've flattened it to 2 different thicknesses. This is the piece I'm going to use for the band. I flattened this to about 1.6, 1.7 millimeters. Oh, closer to 1.6. This other stuff that I'm going to use for the little borders, that's going to be the band part. I wanted it to be slightly thicker than this. This is just going to create the box that this is going to be sitting on top of. And so this has been thinned down a little bit more yet. We're more like a millimeter. So actually this is a more like 18 gauge. That was more like 14 gauge. I'm sorry, I got it backwards in my head. So this is a little bit under 18 gauge thickness. So we'll create a box underneath there. I think I'm going to use 22 gauge for a bottom piece. And that's going to end up, this is not drawn very proportionally, but it's going to have little holes for these bands to pop into with a little catch on there. And then we'll have to create the little ends on the band here that you can push inwards to pop it loose. So I think it should be a fun project and maybe kind of a fun experiment. We shall see. I might use my miter vise jig to get the dimensions right on this one to get these to be a nice rectangle. I think probably let's make the bezel first. Change my mind on that. I think let's make the box first. So, because I can make the box out of this, and then we'll mount that on top of the piece of 18 gauge sheet, and then on the opposite side, after we file it down to where it's flush and nice and rectangular, we can flip it over and mount the bezel on top of that. And then we can start worrying about this other stuff, I think. So that's the plan, I think, going forward. So let's cut one of these ends flat, and then we'll stick it in the miter vise jig. And then we can use this kind of as a guide to how long to make it. And then we'll just, we'll make 2 this length and 2 that length. And then we'll put them together. If you're new to my channel, here's some information about the torch and the solder and the flux that I use. Okay, if you haven't seen a miter vise jig before, they're useful for cutting 45-degree angles or 90-degree angles and making a nice flat surface. You can feed things through the little slots. This one is, you know, perpendicular to that surface. This one up here is 45 degrees. You can see it from the side a little easier. And it's got various slots you can stick different kinds of wire or tubing in. What we'll be doing is probably lining this up along this little fence that's in the middle here. Yeah. If we clamp it in tightly against that, tighten this down, make sure it's flush against that little bar there, and then we can just file that off right up to the surface of that. I think this will probably be an intermediate to an advanced level kind of project, just because of the precise measurements and stuff we're going to have to do, and the number of steps. There's going to be quite a few steps here. So these things leave a little bit of filing burr left over on them that you need to get rid of sometimes. Alright, so when I'm looking at this, I want it to be right up to that corner, so let's do this. Sometimes if you want to get a really precise measurement, and you just have a marker like this, you can make it black like that and then use something to scratch. I have a T-pin over here I can probably use. And scratch where that outer piece needs to start. So that right there. And it's going to go inwards that way. Okay, so that'll help me to know how to position it in the miter vise jig in order to get that angle correctly. Let's see how close we are to this. That's pretty good on the size, so let's make one go in this direction too, and then I'll make a second one of each, probably off camera so you don't have to watch me do the same thing again, and then we'll put them together. They make these that have a 60-degree angle in them too. I wish I had known about that when I first got this, because next time I get one, I'm definitely going to get one that has that additional angle in it. But it is one of those tools that I have found to be super useful in a lot of situations. That's about right. So I'll make one more of these and one more of these. I'll be right back. I'm a bonehead. I just realized my side camera wasn't on when I was doing this. So I took those 4 pieces of that flattened 10 gauge square that I had used in the miter vise jig, and I soldered them all together on top of this pad because it's relatively flat. I used some T-pins to hold these in place so they wouldn't flop over on me, and we got it pretty square. I had to nudge it just a little bit from one side after I soldered it in order to square it up a little bit, but it looked pretty good. And then I took a piece of 18 gauge sheet that was a little bit bigger than this. I'm sorry I did that. I can't repeat it, unfortunately. And I soldered it down onto that piece of sheet by putting some big pieces of solder on the outside after I fluxed it. And we talked a little bit about why that big chunk of 18 gauge sheet on the bottom was going to be harder to get up to temperature than these ones on top here, because it's bigger and it's not as exposed to the flame, since the flame's coming from up here, as these smaller pieces. So they'll reach temperature pretty quickly, so you have to kind of move in and out and kind of avoid the ones that are on top a little bit in order to get them to reach that temperature at about the same time. So that's what I did. And then I just was starting to file the edges down after I trimmed off the excess. So I apologize for that. I will try to remember to turn the camera on for the rest of the video. I hate when I do that. Okay. I am glad that I checked before I continued doing the whole video. Okay. So we got that. That's going to be the top right here, like this. So we need to make the bezel that goes on top of it. And then I think we need to probably shape this into the right size and shape so we know about how big to make it. We're also going to need to cut a piece of 22 gauge sheet to put on the bottom here. But before we solder it on, we're going to have to cut some holes and stuff in it. So we'll go over to the sawing area to do that. So let me do one last little neatening up on this one. So if you include all my Patreon videos that I've done in the past 4 years as well, I've done well over 600 videos. You would think I would remember to turn on the side camera. But no. Not so much. Okay, with sharp corners on a stone like this, you don't want to ever end the bezel on the corner. You want to do it in the middle of the side, because if you do it on the corner, you'll never ever be able to get those to match up very well. All the corners will look a little, or one of the corners will look a lot different than the rest. So let's make a sharp bend like this, and then we can kind of go from there. So I'm going to make a mark where they come together, maybe a skosh beyond. shape this and see if we made good choices on sizing it. So I'm going to mark this because I have that bottom side shaped really nicely for the stone. So I'm going to put that side down. So let me fish out that other piece and we can solder it onto that. So I'm going to give this a little bit of a file, make sure everything's flat in the same dimension. We'll try and get that positioned as centrally as I can. You could scratch across from corner to corner to kind of eyeball that center. That might help too, but I think I'm going to just eyeball it. Because, you know, I always get the results I want when I fake it. But what's life without living a little dangerously, right? Let's flux it a little bit. This time we're going to solder it on the inside. We don't want any of that mess showing up on the top. There's a little solder slop. I'm going to try and dry this gradually so it doesn't boil and move things around too much. Sometimes if you boil it too vigorously, it'll jumble stuff up a little bit. That's also the reason I put the solder in after I dry the flux, because oftentimes drying the flux will cause that solder to move around. And then it's sort of glued in a place you don't want it to be by the sticky flux. Okay, let's put some solder on the inside here. Well, let's cool that off and take a peek and see how we did. So I made this box so angular that I probably, towards the end I'm going to smooth out these corners a little bit, either with a rotary tool or just with my file, so that they're not so pokey. I'm kind of going with more of a contemporary modern sort of style on this one, but you wouldn't have to. You could do something a little more, ornate or sort of westerny or whatever. So I'll probably file that down further at some point, but I need to grab that 22 gauge sheet I have somewhere over here. Okay, and so I think I'm going to leave myself a little bit extra, but I'm going to trace the border of this so that I can kind of get an idea where I need to saw out areas and stuff. I'm going to kind of draw out on the metal here what I'm going to cut out, I think. But to start with, I need to calculate in the thickness of that box. That's about right, like that. Or the walls of the box, I should say. Now I want to find the center of this way. So let's figure out about where the center is. Now let's take a look at this piece of 10 gauge I was going to use for the band. We got to put the band back together, man. So to start with, I'm going to file one side of this flat, I think. Well, this is going to have to be right like that. And then it should make an arch over to the other side here. So let's kind of see about how big we want to make that. It's going to be kind of an approximate size because it's going to be sort of U-shaped. Let's try it about like that. I'm going to mark it right where it's going to butt into the top piece there. We'll see how that looks. And kind of like that. So let's cut it off there and see what it looks like. Those are going to have to fit in there. And then we want the curve to be nice on the bottom. So right now they're slightly too narrow. And so we're going to need to create, with this thing, a little lip that sticks in just a little bit here. The little button is going to stick out here so you can push on it to flex it a little bit so that the part that's going to be soldered onto this wire, you're going to have to push it inwards a little bit to get it past that. Is that right? What if we just file a notch instead? It went just a little ways. So that popped into there. I think that might be a better plan. About that deep. So I might use the saw to kind of detail out that cut. And then we'll put the button up here, I think. Let's go over and see if we can saw that out. I think I'm going to use some marker so I get it a little more precise though. Should be interesting to see if I'm thinking correctly when I'm doing this. I want to kind of do it a little bit below that. Okay, after I did that, I realized I probably did it a little bit too far down, of course. So I want this to sit up so that those latch onto the sheet that's going to be on the back of this eventually. So I need to add a little bit of depth back onto this. So I thought I might just solder this on like that and then cut it off so it just extends these a little bit. You know? That should work better. Might actually need to file it down just a skosh. Okay, so about 1.7 millimeters wide, somewhere in there. So we want to make a little So we need to make, for our little button, let me find some 14 gauge round wire. So we need a piece of this to make a little slot. I'll make sure I'm thinking right here. This is going to be narrower than this here. So I need something for this to catch on a little bit. So let's try and do this right down the center there. So that's going to have to go through this part. It's relatively narrow. I hope I'm doing this right. When you push it in, I want this to unlock from the little thing, so it's going to have to go in a little ways. Need a very small lip there. It's going to be hard to see what I'm doing here, but you know what? I bet if I cut a notch inward to the width of the. Think about this. I think it'll be best if we make this as narrow as the 14 gauge round too. So I'm going to flatten this out. Maybe solder those on with some medium solder. Okay, medium. Here's a little medium. So let's. Let's sweat a little bit on here. Okay, let's see if this works. I think it's time to cut the little slots in the center of this here, off to the side. Close enough. So let's do this. I'll be right back. Okay, so I cut it out of there with the saw, and then I used a little ball burr to kind of round it out and deepen it slightly so that these fit in there nicely now. And they should be pretty good. Something's preventing that side from going down as far as I want it to. Maybe it's just this a little bit. I want it to snap in there pretty snugly, so that's important. I think I'd like the slot for these to be maybe just a little bit, like about twice as big, maybe. So we mark where it's at, right about there, about there. So if we go a little bit further into that, like that. So I'm just going to leave a slight lip that sticks out, and then again I'm going to file those down a little bit too. So alright, let's cut out the bigger piece here. And I think let's then go over and saw some of this out and see how it looks. Okay, so I feel like maybe I should sweat a little bit of maybe medium solder on this one. Actually, you know, it doesn't really have to be medium, I don't think. You can just pick some hard solder on there. Okay, now I'm going to flux this a little bit, and then we'll see if we can flip it over. Maybe I need to make sure that's really flat, though. Well, let's give it a try. That's the worst thing that can happen, right? Most of the mass is in the bottom here. Alright, let's trim this off a little bit and get it filed. Okay, I'm going to get this cleaned up a bit more. I'm going to think about what I'm going to do with these here. Okay, be back in a minute. Okay, other than polishing, the only thing that I did off camera was I added a couple of little discs made out of 18 gauge sheet to the ends of these with some easy solder. And but yeah, I got things polished up, and I've got one little piece of tag board. I use this kind of like legal pad backing sort of stuff. That works pretty well. I do this a little differently than some. I use my chain nose pliers as a bezel pusher and then a burnisher on this part up here. So I usually start with a corner piece like this. They're not super sharp corners up top here. So I'm just going to kind of lean into it right on the corner straight in. I didn't get this perfectly centered on here. Oh well, what are you going to do? And of course this rectangular piece of turquoise isn't perfectly rectangular. Once you have everything kind of bent over a little bit and the stone seems stable, then we're going to burnish it with this outer part here. And that's just rubbing that top edge. It's quite a bit of force. That evens out and smooths out that top edge. Alright. So I'll probably clean that up a little bit more with the blue polishing wheel on my rotary tool, which is kind of the fine end of the silicone polishing wheels. But it should work, unless I polish too hardly. Yeah, there we go. Kind of what I was shooting for. That was a fun one. So tell me what kind of feature things you like. I like doing stuff that has some sort of special characteristic. It does something, or it moves, or it has a secret compartment, or whatever. What kind of things do you guys like to make? And any suggestions as to other things, let me know, and I'll try and do what I can do. So thanks for watching today. Okay, well that was the box clasp ring. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, make sure to hit the like button before you go. I'd also love it if you would visit my main channel page. I haven't checked lately, but I have like 570 or 580 videos over there. I've been doing 3 per week for about 4 years now, so there's quite a bit of content. And I think there's some good stuff. There's some tutorials on how to make particular items, and there's also projects at multiple different skill levels, so I think you can find something that's useful for you no matter where you're at on your metalsmithing journey. So check it out. I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my channel. There's no cost to that, and it really helps my channel. So Make sure to hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to visit the video description down below. There's some important links there. There's a link to my Patreon if you want to find out about the various tiers of membership on that. It's a really nice place with a bunch of cool people over there, so you might want to consider becoming part of that community as well. There's a link to my merch store if you want to get yourself one of those nice design idea sketchbooks. Those are super handy for keeping track of your projects. I have found them to be useful in helping me to draw better pictures when I'm sketching up designs. So, finally, there's a link to my ebook, which I just released at the beginning of January, and it covers all of the videos from 2025. Each video page includes a picture of the sketch I drew, a picture of the final outcome, a list of materials that it takes to make that project. If there's a stone in it, it has information about the stone. It has a difficulty rating, and it has some notes I made about the project, like did I learn something new from it, or would I consider doing this again? Would I change it if I did it again? Did I discover an easier way to do something? Those kinds of things. And there's also a link to the actual video. So check that out, maybe consider getting it. It's a really nice way to have a bunch of projects at your fingertips, and a super nice way to support my channel. So thanks for that. All right, well, take care. Happy silversmithing.